Pheromones. I love using insect pheromones because it's so easy. They come to you and they die. It's fantastic. This one over here is Asian fruit fly trap. So pretty common to see in Hawaii. They just drop a little pheromone on a paper towel and put it inside a canister. They all fly in and then they can't get out. This stuff is fun. Did I tell you what I did when I used this pheromones? I didn't tell you guys. It was the other class. My brother came out to visit, and we've always been practical jokers with each other. Less than 2 years apart, so we got that kind of relationship. And I have several kinds of pheromones. And when we went out hiking in Lapahoihoi, I actually brought the pheromone with me in my pocket, and while he was hiking, I dripped it on his backpack. And then I just stepped back, and it was hilarious. Within 5 seconds, just whoa! There was all these fruit flies and all the Vibe and stuff they were walking through, and he was swarmed by 300 of these things, and he's running around. Ah! And he's a city kid. He doesn't like bugs, man, and it was hilarious, you know, and he's going, ah! And it was just something that you do, trust me. If you can get your hands on some, play a practical joke on somebody because it's hilarious. Just don't put it on their skin because it doesn't wash out, and like 2 days later, they can still attract those things. So yeah, using pheromones, biologically produced toxins. So if you use something like 7, which is going to be, was it pyrethrin? It's made of pyrethrin, which is going to be a plant-based toxin. So it's not plant-based anymore. It used to be. They used to get it from plants. Now they do it synthetically. It's the same molecule, but it's technically still plant-based. It's the same molecule, but they produce it in a lab. But using those types of sprays and stuff, which are going to be a little bit more friendly. So if they're plant-based, they're going to be generally less intrusive to the environment. And then, of course, there's pesticides, good old-fashioned sprays. There are several pesticides that will only kill certain types of bugs, so be really aware of that and know that depending on what your insect is, there might be a spray that might be appropriate for you. Okay. And then there's genetic control using resistant plant varieties. This takes research, and it takes a relationship with the person you're getting your genetics from. You have to have correspondence, emails, phone calls, sending of paperwork that your genetics are officially certified or whatever, that they're disease-free. Get in writing that whatever rootstock or whatever thing you're buying is disease-free. Because when it's not, you can have them come to your property and take the tree out and then address the Phytophthora that they brought to your property. And you could bring them to court for that. So as long as it's in writing saying that it is disease-free. So most farmers won't actually provide that to you, and that's when you laugh in their face and you go, don't worry, I'll find somebody who does, because it's not worth it to buy diseased stock. It can ruin your whole life. So using resistant varieties like the rainbow papaya, which pretty much if you're eating papaya in Hawaii, it's GMO and it is a plant-resistant variety. But there are disease-resistant varieties, like I mentioned from the seed group from CTAR. They have groups of tomatoes and types of corn and stuff that have a little bit more resistance to disease. So the lettuce, the nui nui lettuce, white nui nui lettuce, and then the butter lettuce they have as well is going to be resistant plant variety. It's not GMO, it's just bred that way, and that it doesn't really have the same issues with bacteria that you typically have with any other lettuce. So do your research, know that your values, will I allow GMO on my property or no, and then which ones have been bred to be resistant varieties, if that's the case, okay? Weed control. Oh crap, I gotta connect to the internet.
How do you know if a plant
How do you know if it's diseased when you bring it home? Well,
Disease-free.
yeah, you get guaranteed disease-free. If you can't do that, then you put it in isolation. So you want to keep it in a pot away from everything on your property. Let it sit there for up to 2 months to make sure that it doesn't die off and it doesn't have any issues. Most farmers are going to have like a quarantine area. So I recommend that. Yep. If I'm buying a ton of ginger rootstock, I'm definitely going to make sure that it's disease-free and it's in writing. I won't buy it if it doesn't, and I would recommend that for everybody, especially with the root crops like ginger and whatnot. Okay, where am I at here? I am. What is a weed? What is a weed? It is defined as a wild plant growing where it is not wanted and in competition with cultivated plants. Basically, if it's a burden to human beings, it's a weed. One man's weed is another man's crop. We'll talk about that in a sec. Oops. I have to go here. There. Nah. Get some sleep, son. All right. I was going to prepare a weed lecture for you guys. And then I remembered that my buddy Ted Radovich had already done one, so I called him up and said, hey, can I use this? He said, sure. So we're going to go through his presentation. It's everything I would have said, but he already did it for me. So he's the guy who runs the Sustainable Farming Systems Laboratory, so he's the organic guy at CTAR. He's an amazing professor. If you ever get a chance to hear him talk, he's really into cover crops. He's really into cabbage. So if you ever hear him talk, I would recommend that. There's a list here of cover crop database. It's basically a list of all the cover crops. This is the sheet that I had given to you, I think, last class when I talked about cover crops. And these are just great resources. We'll talk a little bit about flaming, living mulch. Suppliers for any of the supplies you need for weed control. And we'll get into the lecture here. A weed is a plant that interferes with human welfare or activity or is otherwise objectionable. So if it gets in our way, plant's out of place. If it gets in our way and it's causing problems, if it's taking away nutrients from one of our crops, if it's a vector for disease or it harbors insects, then it certainly is a problem. It's considered a weed. Okay? Mm-hmm. Classification of weeds. 3 kinds. We have broadleafed, legumes, grasses, and sedges. Broadleafs will usually be dicot plants. I don't want to get too technical. Dicot plants are what you typically think of when you think of a plant. Veins on the leaves, broad green leaves versus on the bottom you have the grass and sedges, which will have vertical lines on it. So if you look at a blade of grass, all the lines go this way and all the veins go up and down versus veins on a leaf. So that's monocot, dicot. But anyway, dichotic plants, broadleafed, many of them are annual weeds, meaning that they only live 1 year. Their growing points are high above the ground, so they're usually not the creeping kind. They don't bounce in and out of the soil. They usually just go straight up. Succulent growth, usually when you snap them, there's moisture, heavy moisture on the inside, usually a sap or an ooze, and more tender than the grasses. So these are going to be the plants that usually congregate open soil first. Okay, so if you till an area, the first weeds that come up typically are going to be these broadleafed ones. There's also legumes. Legumes, annual or perennial broadleaf plants. The great thing about them is that they fix nitrogen. They take nitrogen from the air, they give it to the microorganisms in the roots, and are more tolerant to poor soil conditions. So one man's weed is another man's crop, right? So legumes in my field are usually left alone. I usually let them kind of creep around and do whatever the heck they want, because they do fix that nitrogen. If I know that I'm going to till those back in or somehow harvest them. And then you have grasses and sedges, often strong perennials. They live many, many years on end. The growing points are close to the ground or below the ground. They usually have runners. And then tough foliage with high silica content, really woody. Okay? So those are the three kinds of weeds that typically found in Hawaii. Some pictures of those. Now, one man's weed is another man's crop, right? So when this shows up in my field, what do? I leave it. Why? That's a damn good green. You ever put amaranth in your salad? There's 4 different kinds of amaranth that grow in Hawaii as weeds. One of them is a red variety. These varieties are grown in Africa and Asia and the Mediterranean as a crop. And they grow them as a leafy green. So anytime I see amaranth, I actually will address the bug issues because they usually have a lot of bugs on them, and I'll keep them around. And then I actually mix that in with a little bit of mizuna, a little bit of arugula, and some lettuce, and put it all together. So whenever I pull a lettuce from my garden, it usually has a little bit of amaranth in it, which is a weed that just shows up on its own. So being able to identify the right crop and then knowing that, hey, I'm just going to leave that because it's delicious. That's pretty gross. I think it's... Oh, is it? Yeah. Legumes. You got the Japanese tea and the sleeping grass. Ones that don't sleep, ones that do, right? They all have thorns on them. The sleeping grass is actually kind of great if you have plants like... I have peppers that the rats will come in and start pulling off my peppers. And actually, I'll keep sleeping grass around my patch, and they don't go in there because of the thorns. So you can actually use them as a deterrent and use them and utilize them. So not always a weed. Yeah. And remember, it fixes nitrogen too. So as long as you're going to till it back in or allow it to just decompose, all that nitrogen is going back in. Okay? And here's the legume nodules. Basically these little, anytime you see one of these out in nature, give it a yank, pull out the root, you'll notice that there's little bumps and nodules, and these are little houses to keep microorganisms in so that they can help fix nitrogen. So you can't fix nitrogen in aerobic conditions. It has to be in anaerobic conditions, meaning no air. So it actually creates a house where it can take all the air out and create a moist condition where it's high in water, so there's not a lot of air in there, and then it allows you the fixation of nitrogen. Grasses and sedges, of course you got the guinea grass and the purple nut sedge. California grass. Getting rid of these is certainly problematic. For the most part, you have to completely remove the entire plant, and that includes the nut that's sometimes 3 feet down in the grass. I've pulled out purple nut sedge with nuts that are this big out in Oahu. And no. And I actually took these to a weed specialist, and I said, how old is this plant? And he said it's at least 20 years old with a nut that big. And it would be impossible to get rid of it unless you dig down and remove it, which is what I did. So guinea grass, 8 feet. It'll grow like 8 feet, 10 feet sometimes. Yeah, it does runners. It has runners, but it has a nut as well. It has a storage unit where at any point if you rip that plant out, it'll just shoot up another root. This is where that's all its energy is, and that nut is just basically carbohydrates. So it's just an energy source to continue popping out more and more sucker. So it has runners and seeds. So it goes along the ground and creeps, and it also seeds out. So it's an awful, awful plant to have. Now, if you were to say use the guinea grass as a border control, then it's not a weed anymore, and you're actually able to use it to prevent insects from coming in. Problem is most insects really dig on that area, at least crop insects. So not really the best border control. I would use something like vetiver, which has much better grounding, so the roots go deeper into the ground. They're much taller. It doesn't have the little pokies in it, and insects don't tend to go near it because it has certain chemicals in the leaves that prevent insects from biting it. So vetiver, they actually they use it as a erosion control because of its roots, and usually on the hillsides and whatnot. Vetiver. Now, it's also vetiver. They do have it in Honamu out there. That's growing wild all over the place. And then most people will cultivate it. They'll actually seed it out and put it out on their borders and where they have like slanted land to keep the soil in place. The beautiful part about vetiver is you can actually harvest the roots, and that's the #1 ingredient in Chanel No. 5. So they actually use it for perfumes. So, yeah. Agricultural losses. Okay, so weeds will cause direct competition with crops. They will host crop pathogens and nematodes. They clog irrigation water, contaminate crops with seeds and seed parts. They reduce access to the fields or pasture, and sometimes, when in the case of like fireweed or something, they're poisonous to livestock. Superior light interception and use. They tend to take advantage of light more than any other crop, so more than trees and that kind of thing. So this is when you get this draping effect with these vining types, these climbing types. I had a real problem with this, the wild bitter melon in Waimanalo, all over my trees, until I started harvesting the wild bitter melon and selling it. The Filipinos were crazy for it. So yeah, it's like, hey, why not? Just let it go. The problem is they were all over my banana trees, and I would much rather have the bananas. They have superior reproductive ability, so they germinate under a wide range of conditions. Most crop seeds have to have a very specific condition, and that's because they have been cultivated for so many millennia or whatever. So things that grow out in the wild, they tend to germinate in a wide range of conditions. The seeds are viable over a very long period of time. Some of the seeds that get tilled into the soil can stay down there for 20, 30, 40, 50 years before they're once retilled again, and they can just be exposed and start germinating. Okay? They rapidly reach reproductive stage very, very quickly. If you ever got a patch of just weeds, just watch it. And just notice how fast the biomass grows on those things. And then how fast does it go from emergence to seeding? Sometimes a week, sometimes 3 or 4 days. And it's like, how are you reproducing already? You know? Seed production is high. So most weeds will produce an ungodly amount of seeds. And that is to bring genetic biodiversity to the environment, so that if it spreads its seeds all over the place, and then those seeds germinate, and then they can, there's so much genetic variability in there that those can actually fruit each other out or pollinate each other, even though they're from the same genetics. So when you put out 1,000 or 10,000 seeds, there's so much genetic variability in there that you can actually have the spawn of that emerge up and actually create more genetics. So high production, high seed production. And alternate hosts. Problem with the amaranth is it hosts maloidogyne. I love that. To say it like Jerry Lewis. Like maloidogyne. Those are the root knot nematodes. So you got to watch out for that. If I'm harvesting a whole bunch of amaranth and all of a sudden my beets have root knot nematodes on there, I might want to get rid of my amaranth, right? But because of my IPM plan, I already have it in place that I'm looking for those things and I'm watching for them and I know that they have that relationship. Allelopathy. Beneficial or harmful effects of one plant on another by the release of chemicals from plant parts by leaching, root exudation, volatilization, residue decomposition, and other processes. Basically, there are plants that will create a chemical that will prevent other plants from growing. So they will actually ooze out stuff in their roots, or they will send out a phytochemical in the air that will prevent germination of other plants, other seeds. So only their species can exist in that area. So just know that a lot of weeds have allelopathy, and you can use allelopathy as a beneficial thing. So if you do things like clover, clover has allelopathy. So it actually oozes out things in its roots that prevents other plants from growing. And as it creeps along, I like to keep the clover there because it prevents other weeds from coming up. And as long as you address the need for the clover, the clover's need for nitrogen, if you address that and you actually put enough nitrogen out for your plant and the clover, then you just have a beneficial weed out there that's preventing other weeds from taking over, and you don't have to mow it, and it's nice and low, and a lot of insects don't really dig on clover because it has that allelopathy, it has chemicals in the, if you notice that bugs don't usually eat clover. It's usually that little three-leafed thing and there's no bites on it. Why? It's because it sends out a chemical that prevents insects from biting it. So why not keep that around, right? So, know that allelopathy exists. And we'll talk about weed benefits. So, a lot of organic farmers will not pull weeds. They just kind of let them do whatever they want because they protect topsoil, prevent erosion. Most importantly, to a guy like me, they make a place for microorganisms to exist. So, when you take out all the weeds out of your garden or out of your field, and you have just your crop every 3 feet versus a field that hasn't been pulled out, the microorganism respiration rate on one versus the other is just 2 different continents. So you have to ask yourself, is the biology of the soil important enough to me to address it without pulling them? So that's what I would do. I usually will keep some sort of cover crop. I don't like open soil. It's too much volatilization. There's too much money being wasted right there. So using it to protect topsoil, conserve moisture. The clover certainly would do that. Or just letting your weeds go crazy. Plenty of moisture stays in that soil. It doesn't just get baked out by the sun on the open soil. Extensive root systems penetrate deep into the subsoil, which improve crop root growth. So as the weeds break down the hard soil in your field, the crops can grow right around next to it and get through that broken soil. Improves drainage. So as the roots go down and then the plant dies or it stays alive, the water trickles down and allows more water to go into the soil, and it accumulate nutrients from the subsoil, particularly trace elements, and transport them to the soil surface. So weeds will actually take things like cobalt and copper and things that are micronutrients from down deep into the soil, bring them up into their plant structure, and then die off, and then those micronutrients are available for your crops right at the top of the surface. So they are important in that regard. Nurse crop. This is going to be where you basically plant a crop next to a crop for whatever purpose. Some of them have allelopathy. Some of them will, like I said, won't allow insects to infest the area because insects don't like to bite that kind of weed, so why not keep that weed around your crop, right? That's a nurse crop. Food and shelter for beneficial microorganisms, beneficial organisms. So yeah, it produces a food source for, that's a little iffy. More like a shelter for beneficial organisms. So it gives a place for them to live and exist in the environment, because if you're growing something like tea leaf, it has very waxy leaves on it, and insects don't usually stay on it for very long. It's really slippery to them, so they don't really enjoy that area. So why not have some weeds next to it to give those beneficial predators a house to live in, and then go onto the tea leaf to eat any slugs or whatever may be on there. Food and medicine for people. So like you said, some of the weeds can be food or medicine. And then information about soil quality. If all of the weeds in the area look like they have some sort of deficiency, chances are you're probably not going to want to plant right into there. So you're going to want to do a soil sample. It might be an indicator of some sort of deficiency. If all the weeds in an area are yellow, chances are there might be something in there that you want to address before you plant any crops. A couple food and medicines. Weeds that people use. Well, how can I manage them? Well, integrated weed management. Basic elements would be focus on reducing populations below levels that cause damage. Remember the threshold thing I was talking about? So focusing on keeping your weeds at a level that is below a threshold. Multiple tactics employed by in a compatible manner. Just like the IPM I had mentioned, you're not going to want to try one approach for anything. You're going to want to try to combine approaches to make sure that your efforts are not in vain, and that if one of them didn't work, you've taken a plan B and come in and address the issue with the plan B, and then at least you know for sure that if plan A didn't work, plan B works. Focus on multiple bottom line: economic, environmental, and social sustainability. It's your values. Management strategies: prevention, cultural, mechanical, biological, and benign neglect. Don't allow weeds. This is the one strategy he has. If you can do this, you will control your weeds. Don't allow your weeds to go to seed. Let's talk about seed production. Average number of seeds in the soil is 30,000 to 350,000 weed seeds per meter squared. It can be as high as 20 million to 1.4 billion per acre. And look at how many seeds that one amaranth plant can send off. Lamb's quarters, crabgrass. Okay? So even on a small level, you have 3,000, that's a lot for one plant, right? You can make 3,000 plants off one plant. Or you can make 250,000 off one plant. And if you got 10 of them in your field, just times that by 10. One year of seeding equals 7 years of weeding. If you let your land go fallow for 1 year, it's going to take you 7 years to get it back to the way it was. Critical period. Generally, vegetable crops are kept weed-free during the critical weed-free period in development. Hey, I flipped this. Can you still hear me? Blah, 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 blah. Okay. What was I saying? Generally, vegetable crops are kept weed-free during the critical weed-free period. These are going to be 3 to 5 weeks for transplants and grains, more than 5 weeks for direct seed veggies and veggies with small canopies or wide spacing. And onions are kept weed-free throughout.